So it looks like we have quite a good level of attendance in time for 1:30. So at 1:30, I'll start with a brief introduction to the both of you and your presentation and then hand it over straight to you. Okay, since we seem to have quite a nice audience ready and everything's up and running with the presentation, I'll get going with the introductions so we can hand over straight to Laura and Gaia. Good afternoon. My name is Mira. Some of you might have seen me before. I work with Gabby in the research area, knowledge governance and transformations. Firstly, very, very, very warm wishes from Gabby, who is quite unwell these days. And so unfortunately was not able to take over moderating for such a long session this afternoon. So I'm taking her place or trying to do so. As you well know, strategic foresight and forecasting, backcasting, evidence-informed policymaking are really key elements of Gabby's expertise and interests and experience. So, of course, aside from the speakers, but if anyone wants to be continuing this conversation with Gabby, asking more questions, talking about the research, you know full well that she's very, very available to be talking about this more after today's session. So today we have a presentation by Laura De Vito and Gaia Taffoni titled Co-Creating Futures. Gaia is a lecturer and a researcher in public policy, and she's also a teaching associate at the Florence School of Transnational Governance at the UWE, where she teaches policy evaluation. She did her PhD and her postdoc in the Università Statale of Milan and at UCL in London, respectively. And in the past, she's also taught in Genoa, in Milan, and at King's College in London. Primarily in her research, she focuses on regulatory governance and how evidence is used in public policy and public administration. And her current work is looking at how these regulatory procedures affect trust in the fintech sector, which is very interesting. Her previous work, which is what's tying into the presentation today, has examined how regulatory tools help governments with anticipatory work, like strategic foresight, and then how you integrate these tools into the full policy cycle. That's what we're going to see in the presentation with Gaia, with Laura. She's collaborated on developing foresight and anticipatory governance methodologies and is a member of several associations on regulatory policy, public policy, political science, the right to science, which is very interesting in terms of the participatory element that I think they're bringing into their research, and science for democracy. Kind of picking up on that thread and where we're going with the presentation today, Laura De Vito is a senior research fellow in at the Air Quality Management Research Center in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Western England in Bristol. So already we have a very interesting intersection here of a social and social science and public policy background and in the governance of more scientific and geographical spheres intersecting, which is very nice to see in this presentation. And she specializes in public policy and environmental policy. She works at that interface of science and policy, but specifically for long-term and future regarding policy. And that's what we're seeing today in terms of how to make your strategic foresight a very sustainable and very long-sighted approach. Her past research has looked on air pollution, net zero policy communication, place-based approaches to biodiversity, citizen science, intergenerational fairness, and more recently, she's been looking at the strategic foresight in sustainable development governance in Wales. And that's where the presentation is coming in. This research that they've conducted is looking at how we're bringing together, not only looking forward in terms of strategic foresight, but bringing in past policy evaluation as an essential part of making strategic foresight a part of your policy cycle. And they've compared findings from Wales, Portugal, and the EU. There's a very interesting array of support by public and private actors for the research they've done, which is a very unusual element to see so explicitly in the legislative documents that are coming out and in the research support. So we'd be very interested to hear about that. And without any further ado, I'll hand straight over to our speakers.
Thank you, Mira, for the introduction. I think I will make a start and then hand over to Gaia about halfway through the presentation. So like Mira was saying, I've been working on strategic foresight for the past couple of years, and particularly how to integrate into policy practice in government, but also more widely public sector organizations. And today I'm going to talk to you about how foresight can contribute to the policy cycle, why governments decide to invest in strategic foresight and foresight resources. And I'm going to show you a couple of experiences from the UK government and the Welsh government, which is the main stakeholder I've been working with. Sorry, I've got a pop-up asking me to confirm that I'm speaking in Spanish, but I'm not. Let me just get rid of that. So yeah, the Welsh government is the main government I've been working this, and they have a very interesting legislative framework that is all geared towards long-term. So it's an interesting experience in itself to talk about. And then I'm gonna hand over to Gaia, who will talk about more from a more theoretical perspective, the challenges and opportunities of integrating foresight in the policy cycles, and the importance, like Mira was saying, to also consider the policy evaluation phase. So for those of you that are not familiar with foresight, the way that I understand it, I define it as a way of thinking, practice, underpinned by a set of techniques and methods that help you to analyze the long-term impacts, implications of your policies and interventions. And also there are many interpretations of foresight, but the one that I have been working with comes from academics previously based at Manchester University that propose a version of foresight that is inherently participatory perspective, so obviously future-oriented or future-regarding, and policy-oriented, so really framed as a mechanism to strengthen and to come up with better policy decisions. So yeah, the participatory element is not necessarily always there in certain foresight exercises, and that's fine, but the framework that today we're working with and presenting is based on this definition. Can you change slide, Gaia, please? So why do governments use foresight? There are different reasons for why they decide to invest resources and money and to hire professionals, experts to conduct foresight exercises within a strategic level, a very senior level, but also with policy teams to integrate long-term perspectives into policy decisions. So it's used to engage with and deal with the uncertainty and the complexity that they are facing, that policymakers, decision makers are facing in a way that we can say is unprecedented. And they need to be able to handle this uncertainty, to not necessarily avoid it because they can't prevent crisis from occurring necessarily, but so that they can be better prepared, so they can be more proactive in formulating strategies that already take into account that uncertainty and that complexity. They can also use foresight as an analytical tool to assess their own policies in the long term. So whether they're going to have the policy and interventions can have consequences on impacts on certain trends or certain societal phenomena. So it's more like as a proper policy analysis tool, if you like. They can use it as a strategic mechanism to focus their priorities and monitor, keep an eye on signals and issues that may be emerging. So maybe they're not as important now, but they may become prominent in the near future or in the in the medium term. So they can use it as an early warning system. And also, very interestingly, foresight is a very powerful mechanism for participation. So to co-develop visions for the futures, shared goals, shared understanding is not necessarily about achieving complete consensus, but it's about giving a space, creating a platform for citizens and stakeholders to come together and co-creating visions for the future. In my experience, it's also a very powerful mechanism for learning within policy teams and unlock creative and critical thinking. So it's a very interesting, multifaceted approach that can improve policymaking. Next slide, please. The other thing I would like to stress today is that in my research, I sort of categorize foresight, strategic foresight, according to two levels, as I've seen it in governments, used in governments. So there's a more strategic foresight element, which is conducted normally by central foresight units, so dedicated teams with allocated resources that are normally occupy a very central space in government, so often they're in cabinet offices, and they produce very high-profile foresight work. They work on megatrends, they do horizon scanning. They sometimes, like in the case of Finland, they are responsible for liaising with parliament. So they're very high-profile strategic central teams. But then there is another level that I call embedded foresight that is more about the application of foresight to individual policies and interventions. So it's more intended as a practice that is diffuse that policy teams use and adopt, and as I said, that can help to identify these risks and opportunities and strengthen the anticipatory system that you're operating with. Next slide, please. So what does it look in practice and how it can be used for decision making? So this is a relatively recent foresight work that has been conducted by the Government Office for Science in the UK, which includes, it's not exclusively a strategic foresight unit, but they have two foresight teams. One is called Futures and provide training to policy teams to drive that embedded foresight that I was mentioning. And then there is a foresight team that conducts the more strategic studies that are interdisciplinary, cross-departmental. And this net zero society scenarios and pathway study is one of them. I think it's one of the best foresight work I've seen. Obviously, I've got limited experience with this, relatively new to the field, but this is really methodologically very interesting because they combined different methods to produce a very informative output. So they started from evidence, secondary and data analysis, and then they conducted through participatory approaches workshops to sketch out some alternative scenarios on the theme of net zero, the pathway to achieve net zero. And the interesting thing is that they added to this participatory, more qualitative element also a quantitative, more analytical modeling exercise, because they were able to quantify each scenario essentially and come up with a very clear estimate of what it would take if we ended up in each scenario, what it would take to achieve net zero from an energy, particularly from an energy perspective. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 scenarios, and they analyzed two key uncertainties that were, in this case, economic growth and technological change. So the interesting thing is that for these scenarios, that, as I said, were all four of them were quantified, they concluded that for all of each scenarios, regardless of whether we would end up in any of the four, net zero is possible, is achievable. And I think this is a very powerful message to give government and government departments, and that can really focus the attention and create, energize actions in this space. So this is as I said, it's publicly available. So if you're interested in this type of work, this is certainly one of the more comprehensive from a methodological perspective work that I've seen. Next slide, please. And this was the one I presented is an example of the high profile strategic central work. The work I've been doing with the Welsh government has more to do with the embedded foresight, so the foresight that is conducted at the policy teams level on individual policies. And this was funded by the ESRC, which is the Economic Social Research Council that funds social research in the UK. And I was working in a Welsh government division called Sustainable Futures. Before I describe the type of work I did, I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the Welsh context. If you go to the next slide, please. Because it's the legislative context in Wales, for those of you who are not familiar, it's very interesting. It's unique in the world currently. It's characterized and heavily shaped by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that was approved in 2015, and that sets by law 7 wellbeing goals loosely derived from the SDGs, but strongly localized through a participatory process. And these goals are legally binding and apply to all public sector in Wales. So it's not just about government departments, it's about schools, fire brigades, local authorities. They all have to demonstrate how their actions, their decisions contribute to achieving these 7 wellbeing goals. They have been co-designed and developed through visioning strategic foresight exercises done in participatory ways in the years before 2015. Next slide. This slide, I'm not going to go into the details, but it describes the architecture of the Act. And an interesting thing to note is that they identify 5 ways of working sustainably, and in this there is it features long term. So long term is also a criteria that all public sector bodies have to demonstrate they are contributing to, and also has got a legally binding definition. So the challenge that they had was how do we help public bodies that don't have a strategic foresight unit necessarily to engage with long-term thinking, to actively contribute to anticipatory governance and strong decision-making, to then deliver the 7 wellbeing goals. So that was kind of where my research came in. I conducted a study that was published back in January, and today I'm going to present you also an example of the activities I did for applying foresight in the policy, in a live policy setting. Next slide. No, we can skip that. I've covered more or less what I said. So one of the policy teams I worked with was the air quality team, and they were working on the new Environment Act that included changes and updating to the Clean Air legislation. So I was able, as I was embedded in the Welsh government, I was able to approach them directly and gain their trust in a sense. I was a trusted actor in that context, and they considered me a critical friend because obviously they were working on a bill that wasn't in development. They were doing consultation on it. We conducted a foresight using traditional foresight methods, we conducted this foresight analysis. Oh, I lost the slides. I don't know. Is Gaia?
Seems we've lost Gaia
I think we lost Gaia.
entirely.
Yeah.
You, if you'd like to send over a copy of your slides, I can share them while we're waiting for Gaia to be back.
I can keep talking while I send this. Yeah. So yes, I've organized a pilot, so this is not a full-fledged foresight exercise by all means. This was a pilot to understand, not so much to shape, to change the policy, because obviously that was a bit late in the process, but still give them some input and demonstrate how foresight could be directly applied by them in their context, and above all, to understand the challenges, the barriers of really truly embedding foresight as a practice, because foresight requires time, expertise, and a shift in mindset often. So we conducted this exercise as a pilot to understand what it would look like on the ground in the context of scarce resources and all the challenges that civil servants in government could you can imagine face. So we did a fairly simple exercise of analysis of consequence analysis, like the function that I described in the earlier part of my presentation. And then from that, we did some trend analysis, and we sketched out 3 scenarios. In the case, they chose to do 3 scenarios, one worse than expected, better than expected, and different than expected scenario. And they came up with some priority actions that could help them to move closer to the better than expected scenario and try to avoid the worse than expected scenario, if you like. I don't know if the slides have arrived, but I'm happy to just keep going. When we did the evaluation of these pilots, I did the pilots with 3 different policy teams. And it was interesting to see that although they came from very different departments, they all came back with, during the evaluation, with common threads, common themes about the benefits, how they found it a useful exercise, but also what they anticipate the challenge would be in doing this, in integrating it in their daily practice, in the policy making in the true sense of the word. So in terms of the benefit, what was interesting and came quite strongly was that creating the space for this long-term thinking and bringing the bigger picture into the policymaking sphere helped them to be more critical and to really change their mindset, to focus more on the outcome that they wanted to achieve rather than the immediate priorities, what they felt it needed to be done. It also helped to critically assess the role of stakeholders, because they realized that the stakeholders that they thought were immediately important and influential now maybe wouldn't be in the future. And they were able, in general, to think more strategically about the bigger pictures and how these exercise their individual policy interventions could link better to the strategic goals. These strategic goals of the Wellbeing Act helped them, gave them the permission, essentially, to think about the long term and to think differently. So that we need to recognize that having the powerful legislative framework that sets in law the expectations to think about the future, create more of a headspace for them. Next slide, please. On the other hand, some of the challenges that they highlighted were related to lack of competencies. Some in the field, we refer to these as future literacy, to the need to develop some skills to conduct the exercises. And here, you know, we need to make a distinction between what is needed at a team or department level. So maybe someone with some methodological expertise, and distinguish that from what is needed at the individual level. At the individual level, the skills that you require for a successful strategic foresight exercise really are about critical thinking, approach the exercises with an open mind, being collaborative, and be prepared to work across silos, because silos still remain one of the big barriers to really deliver the benefits of foresight. And then next slide, please. So some open questions that Gaia and I are exploring. How do we make, and then Gaia will talk a bit more about this open questions, so how can we make sure that foresight or strategic foresight is a legitimate, robust, and reliable source for evidence-based policymaking? Especially when you don't have the resources to conduct a fully fledged strategic foresight report that I showed you, that in the net zero, like in the net zero report that I showed you. Who is in charge of strategic foresight exercises? Who are the experts? Is it external consultants? Is this expected to become a policy competency? And how can we maximize the potential for strategic foresight to become a mechanism for learning? So to strengthen the learning along the policy cycle, but also between policy teams. That's all I wanted to say. Is Gaia back?
Yes, I hope so.
Oh, great.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, thank you, Laura. And caveat, I don't know what's happening here with the internet, so in case you don't see me, I will try to reconnect, but it seems to work now. So thank you very much, Laura. And I'm just introducing the second part, which is more theoretical. These are two lines of research that we are developing with Laura, and one is actually the most recent paper that came up in November 2023, and it's also open access, so you can always read it if you want. Let me start with the first point that Laura mentioned, and the considering strategic foresight and foresight exercises as also a tool for evidence-based policymaking. So we started with this inquiry and looking at also a little bit on the literature of and the findings on, of course, evidence-based policymaking. What is needed, what we know is that governments need to somehow incorporate data that also consider the impact and the long-term trends. And in this sense, as we have seen, foresight and strategic foresight exercise are really a great tool that really help to anticipate the shocks and also to be prepared mostly. However, what we found in the literature on evidence-based policymaking, and the fact that foresight is overlooked, there is not much there. So the first questions that we raise is how can foresight actually be integrated and also considered as creating evidence, and especially what type of evidence is that? What can we say? So what we know is that looking at evidence-based policymaking, there is a hierarchy of types of evidence. So of course, you always find at the top the empirical evidence that comes out from randomized control trials. You have also more analytical studies, time series analysis, but then you also have more on economic kind of evidence, for instance, cost effectiveness analysis, cost benefits. The typologies and the ranking of evidence, of course, relies on the criteria of reliability of data on evidence. So of course, having such a hierarchy provides really a useful framework for policymakers what to use and how to get data and information, but also for organizing research more in general. But what is important to say that also for policy making, this application needs to be a little bit more flexible and adaptive. So on the one hand, of course, we recognize the fact that there is the need for the rigor in evidence and data and how this is used, but also there must be a sense of considering more of the political process, the cultural context, even the values and the bias of policymakers per se. So what we propose to look at in order to enlarge the vision of and the horizon of evidence-based policymaking, and mostly the scope, is to look at another kind of criteria. Certainly wearing, if you want, the lenses of rather than reliability and rigor of evidence only, or so what we call enablers of mechanism. So if, for instance, we think of the classical blocks that exist that don't allow the data, expertise, analysis to be uptake in the policy making, we see that strategic foresight enablers or mechanisms, if you want to call it, that are actually allow for this uptake are at least two. So the first one, and I'm sorry, I'm going to another slide, and the next one as well. Perfect. So the first enabler is the one of appropriateness. So here, the application of evidence in policy making must be appropriate to the specific context and also on the environment of the policy action. So what we know is that policymakers require often solutions that are tailored to specific problems, to specific also social economic context, if you want. So this really means that what is deemed appropriate in one setting might not work in another setting. So policymakers in this sense are urged to consider also different kind of conditions and needs when implementing policy measures. And in this sense, strategic foresight exercises are actually one of the perfect tool for this. Next slide. So the second enabler of mechanism can be called trust. And it's triggered specifically by one specific element of strategic foresight that also Laura already mentioned, which is co-production. So when there is co-production of evidence, which is something that happens in this kind of exercise, this is a real and really relates about the exercises. So mostly what you have is researchers, civil society, scientists, and policymakers that together, for instance, another example is policy labs as a mechanism, they collaborate in workshop to come about scenarios and possible trends. So this really relies also on the notions that policymakers should be engaged early on, as much as early as possible, also in the creation of evidence, so in the research, and not just being basic consumers of evidence at the end. Okay, so I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit of the reflection that we are doing on the types of evidence and the role of strategic foresight as evidence-based policymaking tool. While another reflection that we already done is on strategic foresight in the policy cycle. So this relates to the previous article that I mentioned, and on how to possibly integrate foresight into the policy-making cycle. So specifically, we looked at looking at the cycle, the last step, even though in reality is not always the last step, which is policy evaluation, the ex post evaluation of policies. So looking backward to be prepared to anticipate really requires also an integration we maintain of foresight in this stage. So in our paper, and I'm not going through the examples of the cases that we we explored a little bit in the article, there are good examples where indeed we see that even in the evaluation phase, foresight is considered as a possibility, so as an exercise that is conducted by policymakers, but there is still need a lot to do. So what we found mostly is that, at the initial phase of the policy cycle, especially in inception impact assessment, you will find results from foresight exercises and for informing, the policy at the very beginning, much less in the final phase or in the evaluation of the policy to design a new policy or a better policy. So we maintain that with a more systemic integration of strategic foresight and futures thinking in ex post evaluation, in the phase of ex post evaluation, policymakers, but also stakeholders that are included in these exercises, and desk officers as well, they can acquire knowledge from the retrospective review while designing the new activities and the new policy. And this is very important for at least one element, if you want, because the logic of policy evaluation rests on two important aspects. One is accountability, and the other one is learning from what happened. And specifically, integrating foresight in evaluation triggers what is called in the literature reflexive learning. Reflexive learning refers to a process where policymakers continuously reflect on their experience, on the outcomes, also through a kind of exercise thinking about the actions and the implication for future policy decisions. So new policies might have even be tested on small scales, like for instance in the example of regulatory sandboxes before the actual implementation. So even a reflection on these kind of trials really helps in understanding the potential impact of policies. So again, integrating foresight in the ex post evaluation phase encourages even more the balance between evidence-based approach and the values and principles that really should guide at least policy decisions, and somehow helps also reconcile a little bit scientific data on one hand with more ethical even considerations, sentiments, values of the policymakers and officers. And then the last slide, sorry. Yes, no, the conclusive slide. So this is really just to wrap up about these theoretical reflections that we are doing. First of all, we recognize that strategic foresight can be considered as part of evidence-based policymaking. It is not possible, we maintain, to insert foresight and the evidence in the ranking in the typical typology of evidence-based policymaking, because of the kind of evidence that is produced with this exercise is broad and is different. Specifically, if we use the classical criteria that are used to evaluate this kind of evidence. But if we consider at least two enablers, two mechanisms, one that is appropriateness and the other one that is trust, that is mostly given by co-production, that is at the base of strategic foresight, and we can really consider this as a very important tool for evidence-based policymaking that really helps policies to be based on evidence and also looking at the future and providing for anticipatory also actions. And then lastly, integrating strategic foresight into policymaking requires still today a big attention on the last phase, on the phase of ex post evaluation. And this is particularly important because foresight, more than ever, really triggers reflexive learning in policymakers officers, but also stakeholders that take part in the at the evaluation phase of a policy. So I think this is all from me. I don't know if Laura wants to add something. I hope my connection works all the way.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gaia. I think we're ready for a discussion.
Great. Thank you both so much for your excellent presentation. I will stop sharing the screen for now, just so that we can see all the participants while we're discussing, but I can pull that up at any time if you or the participants want to refer back to a specific slide. So I'm opening up the floor to our very vast audience for any questions and comments. But if no one has any urgent ones first, I have a few lined up. So anyone who wants to jump in, do put up your hand or start. So one question was connected to the sort of two concepts of foresight that you had identified, units and embedded foresight. And I wondered if you had ever seen, or if people have ever discussed, the integration of these two. So you gave examples of a unit model and you gave examples of an embedded model. And I wondered if this was also connected to one of your later questions about silos, where you had entities still working, even in some of your most advanced cases that you looked at, entities still working relatively in isolation. And you also asked a later question of who's in charge of foresight and who's coordinating it. And I wondered if bringing together the unit model and the embedded model might have it running through the system, but you still had a central coordinating unit that bridged those silos and oversaw it. Yeah, so I'd be curious to hear if you've seen any of that or heard discussions about that.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that probably I can answer both questions at the same time. So the UK model, which is different than what's currently in Wales, and also very high profile foresight, foresight countries with a long foresight tradition like Finland. So the UK has got these like two focuses. One is on conducting these foresight exercises, and when they do that, they sort of respond to commissions on demands by individual departments. They only do it if the topic is cross-departmental. So they encourage that cross-departmental work. The net zero is one of the examples. They've done something on food. So it's something that basically they think departments cannot do alone. So that's what they intervene with the more strategic foresight. And then they've got this other unit that does more like the background work of training, showing, creating communities of practice, so that policymakers can share experiences and what works and what doesn't work. So there are two elements, and yes, there are two teams, but ultimately they're all part of the Go Science unit. So they work together. Let's not imagine two completely separate teams. I think I asked myself the question: do you need a strategic foresight unit, or is it more important, or is the embedded foresight is more important? And my conclusion, which I also put in the recommendations to the Welsh government, is that having a unit that is recognizable ensures continuity of that work, and ensures that profile is maintained even when there are, emergencies, crises. You will know that there will be people that, even in a context of crisis, pandemics, wars, etc., will have the protected space to think about long term. So I still think, even though I think that foresight should inform policy practice and should become a practice, I still think that there is a value of having that protected, recognizable unit. Whether you prioritize one or the other, it's a chicken and egg question. I don't know. I've seen some people saying, well, if you get the unit, they can kickstart the process, a bit like, what I try to do. But on the other hand, the challenge to that argument, and I think that I would respond to your other question, is that then the risk that you face is that foresight is perceived as someone else's responsibility. So it becomes something detached and that you don't need to worry about, because there is a unit and they do the megatrends report and they do the horizon scanning. So you need to be careful that you don't lose sight of the practice element. What worked in my experience, more than training, is the creation of community of practice, because policymakers attend training, then they forget or don't know how to apply it. I know we're recording this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Consultants are useful because normally they're very methodologically skilled and they come up with very colorful reports that really are, fascinating to read. But then the problem is that policymakers don't know how to move from scenarios to action. So that's why you need that policy capability, if you like, the competency to engage meaningfully with the process. So community of practice, in my experience, work best to achieve the embedment, because essentially it's a safe space for policymakers to say, I tried this, it didn't work, or, maybe next time you can try this other method or this other approach. Sometimes what they need is to see the workings. How do you set an agenda? How much time do you need to do a scenario workshop? What's the template? I left them all the templates that I used, and that was, one of the things that they value the most, even more than the substantive output, having my workings behind the organization of the workshop. That was really valued by them. And finally, the other thing that they came up with creative ideas to do that. They said, well, obviously we can't afford to train everyone to become a foresight expert, but maybe if there is one person in each division, in each team that's got some methodological training, we can be facilitator for each other. So, I'm in the transport team, I can facilitate a water team session, and then you will return the favor, so that it becomes sustainable. I don't know if I answered your questions.
Yes, thank you. That was very, very comprehensive and a lot of insight into those inner workings. Yes, Maru.
Yes. Let's see if I can put my. I think it's really interesting. Not entirely sure. Well, I'm not that familiar with foresight methodologies, but I am currently trying to develop some facilitation methods based on system thinking and philosophical approaches to deliberation. And one of the questions I had, perhaps maybe because you spoke about foresight largely in relation to policy evaluation, and that made me wonder to what extent foresight exercises may require a prior understanding or prior definition of a policy problem that is not always there. So, I'm thinking in the context of wicked problems, which most policy problems are, where the sort of the definition of the problem is not agreed upon. The boundaries of the problem are not agreed upon, or even not known. There's uncertainty, etc., etc. So I wonder to what extent you can do foresight exercises when you don't have a clear understanding of what is the policy problem that you're dealing with.
So Laura, I will take.
Do you want to take it? Yeah.
I take part, and then you can always jump in, saying that I think and again here I'm speaking more theoretically, and maybe Laura has more experience directly, that this is well suited. So strategic foresight exercises, and again, we can come up with the more nuanced exercises of the big family of foresight. Really are, as we said, really rely on co-production. Really rely on a pool of different expertise that comes together. So whether it be the strictly policy actors that deal with the policy, researchers, scientists, stakeholders that relate to different aspects of the problem, of the policy problem. So designing even an exercise that tries to call in maybe different voices, different aspects, is really the added value of adding a foresight thinking and practically an exercises in the evaluation phase, and where the policy problem is not clear. So I would just say that, yeah, absolutely is possible to use it even when the problem is not very clear, and instead it's also an added value. But I don't know, Laura, if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Gaia, and I would say sometimes what happened with my, as I was facilitating, was that we started with a topic, and then we started analyzing uncertainties and trends and the landscape, horizon scanning, and then as a result, the policymakers realized what the problem was. So it's not necessarily linear, the process. It's the way I see it is really a critical thinking tool that you can apply at different stages and also different levels. So, if policymakers need the space to really nail down the problem, going from issues to problem and then solutions, then foresight, like things like or horizon scanning or the futures wheel can help you to narrow down. Obviously, the caveat with that is that it will be shaped by the people who are on the table. So that opens up, and Gaia has been looking at, the importance of being inclusive and participatory, because that will shape, obviously. Foresight is a tool, is a mechanism, but it's not neutral. It depends who is around the table. So
how that was going to be my second question, if I may just follow up briefly, because you said one of the questions was who should be leading these foresight exercises, and your recommendation to the Welsh government was, some sort of foresight unit to give visibility and continuity. But one of the downside of that is probably the lack of diversity and inclusivity, and to some extent the risk of group thinking if those doing the foresight are too embedded into government. So it might need some thinking there, probably.
Yeah, no, that's why I was trying to distinguish the strategic foresight unit from the practice of foresight, and I defined what the work I did as pilots that were not fully fledged foresight exercises, and I said to the policymakers, okay, now you've done this exercise with me in a safe space around the table. Now you need to go out to your stakeholders, to the citizens, and do it in a participatory way. The net zero report was done in an open space, using participatory. Obviously, I don't know, Gaia, do you want to add something on inclusivity and participation?
No, I'm okay, sorry.
Yes, yeah, so it's a really fine balance, because that's where Gaia and I are thinking, like how to make it legitimate, because as I said, it's not a neutral tool, and it can be a really powerful tool that policymakers and politicians can use, hopefully constructively, to engage society and to think about long term. But there are also some risks with that.
Before we take the next raised hand, we had one question that came in on the chat in the meantime. Happy to read that out on behalf of the asker, and otherwise, if the asker wants, you're very welcome. I'll go ahead. So the question is, beyond informing the policy directions, what measurement is there to see if the foresight/scenarios materialize and the effectiveness of policy is impacted when the futures emerge differently than anticipated?
I'm just taking my time to think about
Yeah, me too. Sorry.
the effective policy is impacted when the futures emerge different than anticipated. So is the question about what if we consider some scenarios and they don't materialize? Is that, do I understand correctly?
And also, one thing we can say now before we listen to the is that of course, and this is the base of foresight, is not it's not a crystal ball, so it's not it's not providing for one scenario, and maybe also this is the limit, but I would say also the goodness of foresight is that it's really making order on the complexities of information that we have, but it's not just giving one direction. This is surely something that foresight is not doing, is to give us one answer. And this is what we are reflecting now with Laura in thinking about what evidence is foresight giving. So and this is again what I was saying about the fact that it's not a cost analysis. It's totally different. So of course you will not have a you mentioned scenarios here. Sorry.
Okay, maybe let me try to come off mute, but I'm on the road. We've used scenario planning and foresight exercise within a UN planning context. And of course, we had indeed a multitude of scenarios and directions as benchmarks and to inform further than development support to a country. But although we applied foresight, the anticipated directions were much more imbalanced already by the time then those policy discussion had evolved further. And so it's a good discussion element, but I also think it can stand alone as a policy informing process, and especially because then we live in a much more uncertain world, and if we aim for foresighting and similar exercises to help us with that risk, then to be still sufficient risk management and also measurement once programmatic or policy directions are being informed by this as well.
Yeah, just to build on what Gaia said, I completely agree with what you said, and in a sense, it's also what can we expect from foresight? How is it useful? And you're right, we're living in a time where changes are fast. So the way I see foresight is not as much as to, as Gaia was saying, predict potential developments and how things could go, but to imagine plausible developments and use those as analytical inputs to reflect on the decisions they were taking now. So to consider things that we were not considering, and also to ask difficult questions that maybe you would want to avoid because they're a bit tricky to unpack. So I agree that it's what you say, that it can't be the only tool to inform policy and it's got its limitations. But still, even though these scenarios do not materialize in the same way that we thought they would, they still can be useful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And Laura, you also mentioned before, it's a critical thinking tool. So of course, it's not substituting any other classical evidence-based policy-making tools, absolutely not. But it's like an exercise. And as you said, it's important to think of creating a mindset rather than being just one tool that is better than others. So it's not in a typologies, in a ranking. It is more a mindset for policymakers, for stakeholders, for all the actors involved. So yeah, but thanks a lot for the question. It's very relevant.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there's Zane.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much for your presentations. I have two questions, complementary ones. The first one is, and please take into consideration that unfortunately I haven't read your paper before this event. So my first question is, what are the most feasible timeframes for strategic foresight and future anticipation? For example, next 10, 15, or 20 years, perhaps 30 or even 50 years. And I'm asking this in the context of how to ensure that the foresight exercise is sufficiently deep and substantial, not shallow and all-encompassing. For example, not being a dump space for all possible wicked problems, gray rhinos, black swans of the current and future permacrisis. And my second question is concerns the multi-level governance. Is there a difference of the most feasible or preferable time frame for foresight exercise and future anticipation for a regional, national, and supranational authorities? I would stick to only these three levels. Thank you so much.
Gaia, I can make a start and then you can
Yeah.
add it. So in terms of time frames, it varies. Normally it goes from 5 years to 30, 50, even 50, as you said, and it changed. The literature says that it varies mostly based on the type of organizations that conduct the exercise and also your goal. So, for example, if you're a private company, an enterprise, you might want to see, okay, what the next 3 years, 5 years look like? How do we achieve our goal that is, in a 5-year plan, like that? From memory, I think that the most common time frame goes between around 10 and 20 years, 15 years, more or less. And that's certainly my experience. It's interesting within governments because often policies are tied to some predetermined cycles, legislative cycles. Maybe, they say, okay, this strategy needs to be updated and refreshed every 5 years. So then aligning foresight, how do you align foresight to that goal, that 5-year cycle, or you go broader? So it's a question, it's kind of that policymakers have to grapple with, and it's a judgment that they make. And then in answer to your second question, I don't think, bearing in mind I work with a devolved government, can be broadly compared to an Italian region, more or less. I don't think there were difference in terms of timeframes in as much as the levers that they felt they could control. So they were saying, well, yes, all very well, but we don't have any power over defense, energy. No. So Guy, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, maybe just like a more fun fact is that we did an exercise and we had to adjust the time frame at a certain point, because I think they started with 30 years and it was just too broad, and the scenarios that came up were absolutely negative, disruptive, so and not useful at all. So we had to adjust it. But so also this is to highlight the fact that from my perspective, opinion, from what I've seen, it's also very flexible how you can. I mean, it also depends on where you are. You can also always adjust if you see that it's not leading to something useful. But this is just my very small example.
I would say though, finally agree with Gaia, you can adjust it. I would say that in my experience, the longer the time frame, probably the more time you need to dedicate to prepare participants, because it can be overwhelming to say, okay, how the world will look like in 2050 or 2060. It can be overwhelming, and that probably having a clear scope might help. So, for example, if there is an education team and I'm thinking, okay, we want to redesign the school curriculum. What are the skills that kids today, people that are 7, 8 today, will need in 20 years' time when they will become fully grown professionals, or 10 years' time even. So that can give more of a clarity, if you like. But I agree that often foresight exercises are very broad, can be overwhelming. And that's why I suspect it's so difficult to go from these scenarios that are so big and broad to actions. What does it mean for me? That's a legitimate challenge, I would say.
So we have another question.
Yes, from Rachel, related to the previous questions on differences of time frame, how do you deal with the fact that different sectors, environmental and social, for example, tend to look at a different time frame? And should we aim for harmonization across sectors for effective policymaking?
Yes, maybe this deals, Laura, with the idea of silos, no? So absolutely, we should definitely aim for not siloization also across sectors in policymaker, and also thinking about foresight exercises. That would be ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And also, I think that if you focus on not on your set, you start from the point that you're not coming to a foresight exercise as the department of, say, environment, but as someone with an expertise and is around the table with other colleagues to work, or stakeholders to work on a problem, to focus on an outcome. That may be a way to think, okay, that's our time frame, rather than coming transport. Then you can obviously bring your expertise and your insights, but yeah, I think you have to sort of leave that at the door a bit. Be prepared to do so at least.
Yeah, great. But thanks a lot for these questions. I think we were really
Very
looking forward to your questions. Yeah.
If we have time, I have one more that had come up quite at the beginning of your presentation, when Laura mentioned that it was useful for her to be seen as a critical friend and a trusted actor. In terms of your experience, and also in terms of how you are guiding the participants in your pilots to take this forward, what does it mean to be a critical friend / trusted actor? What criteria do those key actors end up satisfying in order to conduct these exercises well?
Yeah, so I had to learn on the spot, obviously, because I'm not a trained facilitator, but I had to really be attuned also to their emotions. They are policymakers, we're, as political scientists, we say they're rational actors, they have to behave rationally, fine. They still are people. And if they're talking about, children dying because of air pollution and things like that. These can be quite challenging topics. And thinking that your decisions will impact health, you know, the benefits that a family gets. These are real issues, and you need to acknowledge that they will have an emotional reaction. And during the exercise, I tried to acknowledge that and give them the space, give them breaks when they had to step back from a difficult topic, but also be mindful that if that felt difficult, okay, maybe we couldn't approach it heads on, but I needed to come back to that. And they acknowledged that. They said it was useful for us to have you bring us back to that, because we would have avoided it completely. We would have left it. The other thing I said, I was embedded in the Welsh government, so I had signed the Official Secret Act. I was bound by their standards of behaviors, and I was using their IT system, so they were confident that everything was within rules that an agreement that was clear from them. I wasn't an external as such. I was quite lucky to be in that position. The other thing that helped was that I knew the institution by then, you know, after having spent 8-9 months before I did the pilots in the division, I kind of knew how things worked, and I never sort of made assumptions, you know, about some challenges, or, you know, kind of dismissed their concerns. So I think that's important. Someone that knows the context, the appropriateness that Gaia was talking about is important. And that's why I insisted with them that they should develop their own in-house capabilities so that they have that.
Thank you. We have one more question here in the chat from Lara. Does strategic foresight require forecasting exercises? And what is the relation between the two?
This I must say, Laura, that I find a little bit off guard in the relation between the two. So maybe I'm more expert on this.
Do you want me to take this, Gaia? Or
yeah.
So it doesn't require forecasting exercise. Forecasting can be an input to a foresight exercise, but they're very different in proper like approach. So forecasting is about predicting how things, you know, if things stays in the same way, how will play out. Whereas foresight is about alternative possibilities. So it's not about predicting the linear pathway. So it can be an input. Obviously, you need to be careful that forecasting doesn't impose like this linear paradigm, and then kind of makes it more difficult to think about alternative ways in which some trends or signals may evolve. So yeah, I think they can go together, but it's not always done. It's not necessarily useful. And if you use it, you need to be mindful that it needs to have a clear remit, and then you need to be prepared to abandon the forecasting. Forecasting also tends to be more quantitative and positivistic in nature.
Maybe one last one, unless we have any more coming in from the audience, please do feel free. One that you mentioned in your key findings, you saw gaps in the futures literacy in the actors that you were working with. I was wondering if you had any more specificity on what those gaps were in their futures literacy.
Sorry, what? Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, I think it was in your findings from your pilots in Wales.
Yeah.
I think one of your findings was that there were gaps in their futures literacy. So what those gaps were specifically?
So primarily methodological gaps. So most people at some point in their career attended a scenario workshop or a horizon scanning workshop, but they didn't know how to actually do it. And that's like in terms of methodology, but I think that can be addressed fairly easily. You know, you can go on YouTube, there are free courses available. That's not really the challenge. The challenge is to have the critical and analytical thinking capability to say, okay, this is like a megatrend report. What does it mean for my policy, my area of work? So it's that translation that I think is missing in most cases. Because I'm completely convinced that methodologically, you know, there are exercises that they're not rocket science. That's the thing. You can have very sophisticated exercises, but frankly, you know, you just need Post-its and pens. You know, it's not really that technically that difficult as long as you know what you're doing. It's about using them well. That's the challenge. Gaia, you've been part of workshops recently, more recently than me. So
yeah, in fact, maybe I just wanted to highlight the fact that because of these gaps in the literature of future that we all have, because we are always learning as we take part in this workshop, the importance of building a community of practice is also this, because you share a lot of insights. Even, and I'm not an expert like Laura, I just started recently doing workshops, but every time you do it, you learn something new, or you have insights from even the participants on how to, to carve something a little bit better. One of the gaps that maybe I see is how to use the let's say the outcomes of a workshop. Sometimes that is difficult. Sometimes you have scenarios that, how do we go about this? How do we use them? Do we write a report? But sometimes you have scenarios that are really very different. And so that's also another, I think, a key element in the skills that we need to foster in this community of practice that hopefully will keep growing. So how to use the outcomes of exercises.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your extremely thorough answers, both in terms of your academic findings and your experience in what you've been conducting, both of you. Today, we are closing the session a few minutes earlier due to commitments that are starting immediately at 3 o'clock in different places. So I want to take this moment to thank our speakers very, very, very much, thank our very attentive audience, and invite you, as always, to our next session, which is going to be on the 16th of May at 1:30 as usual. And this time with Professor Christina van Bergen, who's going to be talking to us about harnessing expertise and evidence for effective artificial intelligence regulation, specifically looking at the potential of a digital society observatory. So very interesting. It'll also be interesting to see some of the synergies with the presentation we've had today. So how we might be using different regulatory tools aligned with the strategic foresight methods and policy evaluation tools that you guys have been discussing today. So really looking forward to seeing you there. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, if anyone would like to take this discussion forward with the speakers and with Gabby, do drop a line, and you know that everyone will be very available.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mira, for moderating, and everyone for the very interesting questions.
Thank you. Then I wish you all a good afternoon.
You too.
See you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.